All right, we'll get a second for everybody to get their audio connected up. And then welcome everybody for joining us this afternoon to do some learning. We're going to have a great time with our program today. I just want to start off with a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, you may have noticed that you've joined the call muted, so our participants are going to stay muted for the duration of the program. If you have questions that you want to ask for our presenter today, you can place them in the chat box and we will aggregate those and answer them at the appropriate times. One other thing, just full disclosure, we are recording this meeting and also streaming live to YouTube. So please take that into advisement. If you don't feel comfortable being on recording or being live on YouTube, you can always join and watch the program, the recorded version later on at your leisure. It will be on the Dallas Public Library's YouTube page. With that, I will toss it over to Helen from the Dallas Environmental Quality and Sustainability Office.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And thank you everybody for spending your time with us today. I am going to do a brief presentation and then I'm going to introduce our speaker. And just to reiterate what was shared is that please put your questions in the chat and we will get those. Some of those might be asked during the presentation and some will be held to the end. And also there is a chance we might go over the hour. So if that happens, like Jordan said, please check out what you missed on the YouTube, the Dallas Public Library YouTube page. And also everyone who pre-registered for this session will get an email in a day or two that will have a link where you can download a copy of the recording to keep for your own reference. All right, so with that, my name is Helen Dulac. I am with Dallas Environmental Quality and Sustainability, and I am super excited to be partnering with the Dallas Seed Library on this weekly presentation called Grow With Us. It's every Monday at noon. I just want to briefly tell you a little bit about my department because you might have never heard of it. We started back in 2004 as the Office of Environmental Quality. We worked really hard for 4 years to help Dallas become the first city in the United States to achieve ISO 14001. And what that means is we looked at our operations across 14 different departments to see how we could still provide the same level of service with less of an impact on the environment. So we looked at the vehicles we used all the way to the paper we put in our copy machine. And we then had to get audited every year to keep the certification. And what's remarkable about this is we're talking about Dallas, Texas, not a city in California, not a city in Colorado, not Austin, but Dallas was the first city in the United States to achieve this. So Dallas is green and going greener. Now let's fast forward 10 years where a whole bunch of stuff happened to my department. There was a reorganization in the city and we actually absorbed some environmental operations and we doubled in size. And to reflect that change, we changed our name. And that's when we became Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability. Also that year, we had we increased our outreach and engagement team that I'm a proud member of. And the following year, Mayor Johnson created the Environment and Sustainability Committee of City Council. They meet the first Monday of every month in the mornings, and those meetings are open to the public, and they're great to watch to see what the environmental actions and pulses of the city. Now, if you have heard of my department, it's probably because on May 27th, the City Council adopted the first environmental and climate action plan. And what's really cool about this is that we have a roadmap for the next 30 years on how we're going to tackle climate change. And Dallas is an inland city. There are not many cities that are inland, that are not on the coast, that have one of these plans. Plus, there's not that many cities in Texas. So Dallas is a leader in this again. And I mentioned that my department doubled in size, and you can see what's in green are the new groups that we added. I'm going to talk about one of those just for a moment, and that is stormwater. So stormwater is anytime it rains and that water goes across your property and then leaves your property. Now that can also happen if you have a sprinkler system or you leave a hose running. So what a lot of people don't realize is that's the way a lot of pollution actually enters into our water bodies, our creeks, lakes, rivers, and streams. So if that water travels over your yard and picks up some chemicals that you left on your yard, some oil that dripped out of your car, bacteria that's in pet waste that you forgot to pick up, that's how all of those things end up in our water bodies. So please be mindful about what you're doing outside. Don't litter, try to clean up different spills and messes. And also if you're applying lawn chemicals, follow the directions, don't apply them before rain or on a windy day. So this outreach and engagement team that I'm on, what we want to do is we want to empower you to help save the earth. And we do that by virtual presentations like this and in person when we're allowed. We're also able to do free virtual presentations to any groups in Dallas, like HOAs or clubs and organizations. We have a lot of materials for students all the way from K to college, and we can do different kinds of fun things like seminars and events. And if you invite us to speak, what do we talk about? We talk about environmental topics from A to Z, all the way from air quality to zero waste. And speaking of events, we have a huge one this Saturday. This Saturday, November 7th, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning. It's the 26th Dallas WaterWise Landscape Tour. And that's why I'm so excited about this presentation. This is like our pre-show. This is our pre-game to the WaterWise Landscape Tour. And that is free and virtual, and anybody can join. You do not have to live in Dallas or be a Dallas Water Utilities customer. It's going to be super fun. We're going to have Randy Allen from North Haven Gardens talk about hot garden trends for 2021. We're going to have Amanda Griffith from the Smart Outdoor Technologies talking about all sorts of technology you can use in and outside your home to save water. And we're going to have Susanna Cruz talk about backyard foraging. And a little bit of that might be touched on today. So we will put a link in the chat of how to register for that. And with that, if you ever have any questions or want more information, you can visit our website, greendallas.net. If you ever have a question for me or anybody that I work with, just send an email to greendallas@dallascityhall.com. And also, please follow us on social media. We are Green Dallas TX on Facebook and at Green Dallas on Twitter and Instagram. Make sure you follow us so you can learn about cool courses like this and other neat things that we do. And I am done with that, and I am really excited to introduce our speaker. Carol Clark is a Texas master naturalist, a longtime member of the Native Plant Society of Texas, chair of the Bring Back the Monarchs to Texas Committee, and she is also a Monarch Watch conservation specialist. When she's not busy teaching or doing all of that, she teaches people about pollinators and native plants. She also enjoys looking after her own colossal monarch way station and private wildlife refuge in Cook County. She teaches monarch workshops around the state and is a frequent guest and speaker about conservation topics in North Texas. And we are so excited to have her here with us today. And if you have any questions for Carol, please add them to the chat. Carol.
Okay, hopefully I am unmuted at this time, and I will attempt to share my screen. We'll see how this goes, and hopefully that will go smoothly. All right, tell me what you're seeing.
That's great.
All right, I think we can get started then. So today I'd like to talk to you about some Texas natives that you can plant for a tough landscape that's also resilient. Texas weather is really bimodal. It's either too dry or too wet. It's hardly ever average. And so when we talk about planting water-wise landscapes, we really need to think about whether those things that are really great in dry places are actually going to work in those wet years as well. But we also know that Texas is one of the fastest growing areas of the country, particularly the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we are adding people like crazy. So we all need to be concerned with water conservation so that there's enough to go around. The water people tell us there will be plenty, but when you actually look at their plans, the reason there will be plenty is that they are all planning for us to learn conservation and reduce our personal consumption. Our outside landscape uses a lot of our personal water usage, and turf grass is a really thirsty thing. It uses a far disproportionate amount of the water that we use. So we need to be able to help people divorce from this idea that to be a good neighbor means to have a perfectly groomed lawn of non-native turf grasses. We need to help them understand that a water-wise landscape is actually your best way to be a good neighbor to all these people that you share North Texas with. So we're going to look at some plants that can help you do that. I hope this will advance. Hang on. There we go. So if you go out to a garden center or most stores that sell plants, you can find a lot of Goldilocks plants out there. And if you remember who Goldilocks was, she was that little girl who had to have things exactly right. Not too hot, not too cold, not too soft, not too hard. And our Goldilocks plants are very similar. They want things just right. Not too sunny, not too shady, not too wet, not too dry, not too hot, not too cold, and soils that aren't too acidic or too alkaline. If you choose a Goldilocks plant from your garden center, you're going to have to provide it exactly the right conditions for it to thrive. Wouldn't you rather spend your time and your effort and your money growing lots of great plants that didn't need quite so much attention from you? If you choose Texas natives that are more accustomed to growing in our conditions, you won't have to adjust things so much for them. So what we'd rather grow are our Texas tough plants, things that are used to the way Texas works, whether that's droughts or floods or extreme heat or extreme sudden ice storms. If you do go out to the store and you are just looking at random plants and you're not sure, what would be lower water usage in this big pile of pretty plants that I'm looking at? You could look for some of these clues on the plants themselves. Things with silvery foliage tend to use less water than their counterparts with bright green, spring green foliage. Things with fuzzy leaves are generally water wise and can retain water better within their leaves because of that fuzz. Things with small, reduced leaves or hardly any leaves at all are sometimes really good water wise choices. Thick, stiff leaves that don't transpire water easily are also good choices. Succulent stems or leaves, this is sort of a juicy stem. You break it and it looks watery or slimy in there. Something with a tuber or a corm to store water underground for those tougher seasons. That's also really water wise, or a very deep root system that can drink water from those soil layers well underground. Thorns or spines or sharp teeth somewhere on the plant to prevent things from chewing on it are often a sign that this plant is native to a place where animals need to eat plants to get enough water, and they are there to prevent being eaten. So they're frequently good water-wise choices. And then plants with waxy leaf coatings. So this is just a general list, and as we go through the plants, hopefully I'll remember to tell you this one has that feature, this one has this feature, so that when you're plant shopping, you can look for these features on plants that we didn't cover. So let's start with shrubs. One of the shrubs that I think doesn't get used enough is Sotol. And there are really two kinds. We have the Wheelers and the Texas Sotols in Texas. Wheelers is a gray-green foliage, possibly a little bit more drought resistant than the bright green Texas Sotol. But they both kind of look like a yucca with these really sharp teeth along the edges. Their leaves are also really tough and thick. Here it is in bloom. It's that really tall bloom spike right in the middle. This one can bloom up to 15 feet tall, so you really need to plan for that where you plant it. It loves full sun in a hot, dry location in a really well-drained bed. So if you want to plant this and you're thinking, I'm not sure my yard is quite well drained enough for that, but I still want to plant things that I won't have to water once they're established, you might try a raised bed just to make sure it gets that little bit of extra drainage. Here we have the Wheelers on the left and the Texas on the right, just that subtle change in color with the Wheelers being a bit more gray. These had recently been weed whacked under, so the tips are blunt, but in general, they do have the sharp ends as well as the sharp teeth on the sides. These have been growing at the Heard Museum in McKinney for, more than 15 years, probably more than 20 years. And so I know they're fairly happy in that location, and they have survived both really dry years and really wet years there. Texas sage, you might hear it called purple sage, Texas ranger, zenizo, lots of common names for this, is another water-wise shrub that really actually needs a well-drained location. This beautiful hedge in a local garden in Allen, Texas, is mostly gone now. There have been 2 really wet years, and some of the shrubs didn't survive those wet years. But if we expect it to be hotter and drier in the future, and we can provide a well-drained location for these, they really need no supplemental water once they're established. You can see that silvery gray foliage, which tells you this plant probably has some adaptations which make it very water wise. Prickly pear cactus actually comes in a spineless cultivar that you can plant. It still has those tiny little irritating hairs, but not the sharp spines that are really likely to pierce you at first touch. And it's got a really neat look to it as well. If it gets too big, you simply break off some pads and make it smaller until it's the size that you need it again. Here's one at the Heard Museum and the same one blooming. Those blooms are 3 to 4 inches across, really, really gorgeous. And I'm not sure if you can see, depends on the size of your screen. This one has a lot of buds on it. So starting in about May, it will bloom and it will bloom heavily. It's a beautiful plant. Here you can see several Texas natives assorted in the landscape, including that spineless prickly pear. This kind of looks like Texas what should look like. And it was taken down in Driftwood, Texas, where many of these plants are a bit more local. Just because they're not local doesn't mean we can't use them to our advantage. Here's one that really is local, the little 3-leaved sumac or aromatic sumac, or some people call it skunk bush sumac, but I never understand why, because to me it has a pleasant, spicy smell when the leaves are crushed. This one is a local shrub that makes a nice evergreen, oh, not really evergreen, sorry about that, but rounded shrub in your landscape. It does have flowers that come out in the very early spring, great for bees, and that's followed by berries that birds can use as well. I think this one should be used more, and if you all start asking your nurserymen for it, maybe it'll be more available. Turk's cap. This one is so tough. It survives all kinds of abuse. You can put it in full sun, full shade, anything in between, hot, dry, sunny locations or wetter locations, and it will be perfectly happy. With these beautiful exotic looking flowers, it attracts hummingbirds and butterflies and all kinds of great things to your yard. Buttonbush. Now this one may be a surprise if you really know your plants, because you've seen this at the edges of a lake or the edges of a stream, and you're thinking, that's not water wise. That needs a lot of water. Why would you put that in this show? Well, it turns out that buttonbush really needs a lot of water to germinate and to get started. But if you can find one as a potted specimen and bring it home, it doesn't need a lot of supplemental water in your landscape, and it will be a lot tougher than you think. We've actually seen this growing in road medians that aren't irrigated in tough, dry, compacted soils, and it does fine. So you might consider a buttonbush. Look at all the things that will use a buttonbush in your landscape. It's a beautiful plant and it's worth a try. In an average home garden, it certainly gets enough water to thrive. It also has these great green glossy leaves for extra attractiveness. American Beautyberry. Here's one that I mostly see from East Texas, and I think, wow, that probably needs a lot of water because it's wetter in East Texas. As you go east, you have more rainfall. But then I found it in my dry rocky woods in Cook County, and it was doing fine. There were some large specimens there, and they do bloom and flower in that dry rocky woods. So I think it probably needs less water than we are accustomed to thinking it needs. And what it really does like is some shade. This is not a full sun plant, but it will adapt to drier conditions. This one volunteered in my landscape. It just showed up and I let it stay, and this is what I have now. Here's one you may not have heard of, the Carolina buckthorn. This grows wild in our area, and it's a beautiful green glossy shrub with these berries that start out sort of a bubblegum pink and then turn a deeper color. This one was filmed wild at the edge of a local green belt, and you can see it just sort of makes this solid waterfall of lovely green leaves. If it gets a little more light, it will also thrive in full shade. Again, I find this in my dry rocky woods in Cook County, and so I know that it will tolerate dry soils. Another one that does the same, prefers to grow in the shade, but can grow in part sun, is the rusty blackhaw viburnum. And I frequently find this one along waterways as well, but it grows in my dry, rocky woods. So I know this will take both sorts of conditions. It blooms in about April or May with these gorgeous clusters of white flowers, and these are very attractive to early bees and butterflies. Yaupon holly, you've undoubtedly seen this one at your local fast food place. You know, in there in the landscaping in the parking lot, and it's very popular. It's very popular because it's very versatile. It can be trimmed up in a very formal shape. It can be let to live as a shrubby, bushy shape, which it would normally in our wildscapes. But it's very versatile and it's easy to live with. It's easy to prune. It's not a messy tree. It is a shrub or a tree, so it depends on how you treat it. One form of this is weeping yaupon, where the branches actually arch down. So you might look into that if that's more to your taste. Or the very, very upright Will Fleming holly. These will live for 15 to 20 years before they start to get too big and break under their own weight. But it is a really different look than the basic shrubby or poodly yaupon hollies that you find in our landscapes. You can also buy dwarf yaupons. These are usually just male. They won't have the berries. Yaupon hollies come in male and female plants. So if you want the berries, you've got to look for a female plant and try to find one that already has berries on it so that you can tell. But these are all forms of yaupon holly, which is a very drought-resistant shrub. Coralberry is one that doesn't get used too much, but it's a really neat ground cover type low shrub for a shady area. Now I say shady, but since then I have found it growing in full sun up on my wildlife refuge in really tough, sunny, rocky, dry conditions. So it can take quite a bit of sun. It develops these deep pink berries and it'll hold those through most of the year. We say we grow it for the birds, for the berries, and in a lot of years, they actually aren't going to bother to eat them if there's enough food. But in a bad winter, they will, and those are very valuable to get them through the toughest winters. But again, these are very flexible in their growing conditions and won't need any supplemental water once they're established. Possamall holly is a cousin to the yaupon holly, and it too has the red berries, but only on the female plants. But those red berries are only going to be showing, they're only going to be on the female plants again. So you have to watch and buy one that has berries on it if you do this. It will drop its leaves, unlike the yaupon holly that stays evergreen. And so you'll have this look of the bare branches with the red berries on them, which is really striking in a winter landscape. And though the birds really do like these, they tend to eat them late in the winter. So this look with the bare white stems and the red berries will be there for most of the winter. They save these berries till the very end. I think they need to freeze and thaw a little bit before they're really great for the birds to eat. It also serves butterflies and native bees. Buffalo currant is a small shrub that tends to form a thicket. So if you have a shady side of the house that's fairly dry and you wanted to put in something that can just spread and creep along that edge of the house, buffalo currant might be a good one to put in. It has the most sweetly scented flowers in mid-February up to early March, and those are followed by berries that are edible for humans and other wildlife. It's a really neat little plant. You can buy this at most native plant nurseries, but not necessarily in all nurseries. The more you ask for things, the more they're going to want to stock them. Here's one you probably can find in most places, rock rose, Pavonia. It's a beautiful pink flower. It's in the hibiscus family. And it forms a nice, fairly neat shrub in a full sun location. If you plant this in more shade, it's going to get a little leggier and maybe not make this nice shape that it has in this photo, but the flowers may be worth it anyway. It will bloom better in a full sun, hot, dry location. Here's one I fell in love with a few years back, shrubby bonesetter, fragrant mist flower. It's blooming right now in November, and it didn't even start until mid-October in my yard. And the reason I love this so much is it is wildly attractive to butterflies, and it blooms just when the monarchs come through. But it is from a little bit further south in Texas where it is hotter and drier, and it does great in our Dallas landscapes. Doesn't need supplemental water once it's established. It makes a nicely rounded shrub, and there's just nothing to hate about this one. It can be trimmed back to shape, covered with these sweetly scented blossoms. Beautiful, beautiful plant that blooms at a time of year when the critters really need something blooming. Another one that just finished blooming is the Texas kidneywood. For most people in a full sun location, this has a really long bloom season. I planted mine in the shade, and it is leaning out towards the light, and it doesn't bloom until later in the season for me, but it still attracts all kinds of pollinators. This great purple hair streak that you see feeding here, and many, many other kinds of butterflies are attracted to the Texas kidneywood. The scent is like baby powder to me, like old-fashioned baby powder. And I can smell this clear across my yard. It's a beautiful, beautiful plant with a beautiful scent to it. My friend had this planted in a full sun location with no supplemental water, and it thrived there. Let's move on to Texas stuffed trees. Redbuds are native clear up to Canada, but if you're planning to plant one in the Dallas area, I'm asking you to look for the varieties of Texas redbud or redbud that do best here. And so those would be the varieties Mexicana or Texana. They're all Cercis canadensis, but there are different varieties. And the reason is the Texana and the Mexicana have thicker leaves, they have glossier leaves, and those are better adapted to not need supplemental water and withstand our hot conditions. The Cercis canadensis variety canadensis has thinner, flappier leaves, and plants like that tend to use more water. They just transpire more water. So we want to avoid that to be water-wise in our Dallas landscapes. They're still beautiful no matter which one you choose. They do appreciate a little extra shade, but if you get the Mexicana variety, you can even plant that in full sun in the Dallas area. You can buy a weeping form, and they're just so beautiful. They bloom at the same time of year as our Mexican plums do, and that's another great choice for a water-wise landscape. They grow in the wild with nobody providing extra water, and I've seen them in full sun and full shade and everything in between. So you can hardly go wrong with the Mexican plum. They have almost the same look as a Bradford pear with none of the bad habits. The flower is a little bit more pure white. It smells good instead of terrible, and they don't have the weak wood of the Bradford pears. There's that Mexican plum again. It's a fabulous tree for pollinators and wildlife as well as humans. Now let's move on to some Texas tough perennials. Why? There are great shrubs and great trees. I could go on about them all day, but I wanted to show you some smaller plants as well. Fall asters are blooming right now and attracting pollinators by the bushel. They are just fabulous small plants for your home garden that will bloom late in the season. Here they are covered with butterflies. This is actually a different fall aster than the Aster oblongifolia. This one is a tall fall aster. And if you have the space, it's great. But it does get tall, maybe 4 feet tall. And so you need to think ahead about what your overall height is in your landscape and choose a fall aster that fits your needs. That oblongifolium stays shorter and it will still attract a lot of butterflies. Blackfoot daisy. Here's one I've drowned a couple times because my yard, frankly, isn't so dry. And so I can't do this one. I just have too much shade and too much water. But this is what it looks like out in a local garden. A very long bloom season with these beautiful white flowers. It's sweetly scented. And they're just very sweet. It's a nice plant. Here it is combined with a Dahlia frutescens, black dahlia. Both of these are plants that like full sun and dry feet. They want a well-drained location and no supplemental water once they're established. Most of the plants I'm showing you today are fine without any supplemental water. These two definitely hate wet feet. So if you have a very wet location and that gets cold over the winter, these may not come back the following year. They simply prefer to have it on the dry side. Artemisias will grow well in dry locations. We actually have a native Artemisia, which you could use as a ground cover, but let me caution you that it will spread. Versions of that have been worked on are more silver and have slightly different habits, but still are spreading ground covers. If you need one, that's great. If you don't, you might not want to plant something with those habits. Rattlesnake master. This is a local native, and it's a beautiful blackland prairie plant. But this blackland prairie had its wet years and it had its dry years historically. So this will take both, and it will thrive without a lot of supplemental water. Here it is in my landscape, which isn't very well manicured, unfortunately, but you can see that neat architecture on the blossoms there. It also attracts an awful lot of butterflies. Engelmann's daisy is another tough local prairie native. These neat cut leaves are very attractive even when it's not blooming, but it has a long bloom season as well. If you take off the spent flowers, it keeps blooming for a long time, and it doesn't require supplemental water from you. Mealy blue sage is another local native, and if you can see, it's blooming in my background. That background photo on my thumbnail picture was taken 2 stop signs away from my house in Allen. So it is a local native and it's well adapted for our floods, our droughts, and everything in between. Oh, here it is in the wild. I couldn't resist 1 or 2 more wild pictures just to prove to you this is a local native. Should be used more often. It is used fairly often in our landscapes, but everybody should have it. It's a great plant. A plant from a little bit further east in Texas does very well here in our landscapes, chili pekin. This one is actually a hot pepper plant, and those are fiendishly hot peppers on there. They're small, but they're fiery. And the birds adore them. They don't suffer from that heat effect like we do when we eat them. So they just gobble these things like candy. But this makes a nice low mounded shrub, only a couple feet tall at its maximum, that will stay nice and neat in your landscape. Most years it will come back. If we have an exceptionally cold year, it may not. Another local native, our prairie verbena. This one I transplanted out from under a hot, compacted soil under a swing set in a park in July, and it lived. And I got to tell you, that's the worst possible thing you could do is transplant something in the hot of the summer from bad soil into other bad soil. But it thrived. And so prairie verbena is one you should consider for your landscape. It doesn't want your extra love and attention. It would love some neglect. Here it is out in the landscape in a place that has been recently disturbed. It adores disturbed, harsh, dry locations. and a close-up. It's also one of the first things to start blooming. It'll bloom in late February, early March, some years. And just when monarchs start migrating north, this is available. But if we get rains in the summer that are well spaced, it will bloom all summer long through the heat of the summer and into November. So it can be a long season bloomer for your landscape as well. It does prefer it on the dry side, too much love or too rich of a soil, and it may not thrive. Shiny goldenrod. This was taken up at my farm. A lot of my photos aren't taken in gardens. They're taken in the wild, so these plants may not look well tended. There's a reason for that. But if it looks this good in the wild, think what it will do in your garden. This forms a rounded clump with flat top clusters of goldenrod flowers, and you can see what this does for the wildlife. Absolutely no one is watering up at my farm. That was just native with native rainfall. So you don't need to water these things once they're established. Now I keep saying that once they're established, you may need to water transplants several times until they look like they're growing on their own. Texas blue stars. Here's another great Texas native plant. And I left the species a little vague because we have quite a few Texas blue star species that you can plant. And all of them are pretty good. The tabernamontana species, Amsonia tabernamontana, tends to come from wetter places. So I would stick with ciliata. Hubrichtii is another one that's available sometimes, but they'll all do fine in a garden that is going to be irrigated anyway. There's a close-up. Those neat twisted buds and those beautiful flowers. This is a spring bloomer, and it is very sweetly scented. To me, it smells like a bottle of vanilla, and it attracts the butterflies like crazy. Frostweed. This is a fall bloomer, and it has some neat parlor tricks up its sleeve. It will bloom in dense shade. It will also bloom in the sun. It may stay a little bit shorter in the sun, which may be a good thing. But if you have a shady corner in your yard, this can be a great filler that supplies valuable nectar and pollen at a difficult time of year when a lot of other things aren't blooming. So frostweed is still blooming around my neighborhood, and it was really blooming a couple of weeks ago, but there's still some flowers on it. And that is perfect for migrating monarchs in most years. It's just when they're coming through. You can see all kinds of butterflies, not just the monarchs, are attracted to that. Here's a photo that I borrowed from Rachel Weaver showing how much the butterflies are attracted to this plant. But it also has some neat interest if you have children or grandchildren, or you're just a kid at heart like me. On a very cold winter morning, when the temperature has had a sudden drop, the stems will break open and curly Q sheets of frost will form outside the stems where the sap has leaked out. So it makes these frost flowers or frost fairies, and it looks exactly like your yard has been toilet papered. But no, it's just the frozen sap along the stems of this frostweed. It's a really fun thing to see on a cold winter morning. Maximilian sunflower is still blooming in many places. And it can be a bit of a garden bully. You need to plan ahead for planting this, some kind of containment, either a boundary or a pot, or just put it in a place where it's allowed to run a little bit and pull out the excess at the edges. But it's really a worthwhile plant. Again, it blooms when the monarchs are coming through in the fall, and it is attractive to so many other pollinators as well. It can get 8 feet tall, but this one at Oak Point Park, pictured here with no supplemental irrigation, tends to stay about 2 to 4 feet tall, depending on the rainfall that year. So be careful when you're selecting. Try to do a little research. There's one called Aztec that tends to be very vigorous, maybe too vigorous for our landscapes, but most of the others are less so. One of my very favorite plants, and maybe it's because I'm a Monarch Watch conservation specialist, is the green milkweed. This is a plant that is very versatile in its needs. It will grow in sandy acid soils, black clay soils, which are alkaline. It will grow with no supplemental water, and it will grow in wet years and tough dry years equally well. It attracts monarchs as a host plant and a nectar plant, and it will also attract hundreds of other creatures that can use that nectar. So it's a really great plant to add to your landscape. Here it is. Look how nice and neat that is. That is growing wild in a field in Wise County. It has had no tending whatsoever. That's just the shape it makes in the wild. There's another one I put in a pot, and yes, that pot needs a little weeding. I should have weeded it before I took this picture, but it was happy in this pot, sharing that with a couple of other plants. There's a close-up of those odd but interesting flowers. And the interest you're going to find on this may not be the beauty of the flowers. It's the diversity of wildlife that will come and visit this. An almost constant symphony of butterflies flitting around and visiting. Another one of my very favorites is the Liatris. Now, there are a lot of different species of Liatris, and they're all great. But we have one, the Liatris punctata mucronata, that blooms in the fall when the monarchs come through. So if you particularly wanted it for that reason, you need to try to get the Liatris punctata mucronata. But for any other Liatris, they will still be great. They will still serve pollinators in your garden, and they have water-wise root systems that really help them use water. This one that's local has a storage corm underneath for storing nutrients and water, and also a deep root system below that. So it's able to pull nutrients and water from deep in the soil. That helps it bloom even in a tough year. This was taken on my farm, where again, it's getting no supplemental help whatsoever. And this was taken on a prairie in Fort Worth. And all of those colorful little chips of yellow and orange are butterflies visiting. So it's a great plant to have. And you might want to try hard to get some in your landscape. Again, it doesn't need a lot of care. It doesn't need rich soils. And it's just very flexible in its needs. Another one that is a tough survivor is the Mexican hat. It is a clump-forming plant, and I've been watching one bloom for many years just along one of our local roadsides, right up against a telephone pole where it doesn't get mowed. And so because it doesn't get mowed, this plant has been able to thrive there for years. Year after year, it's just there doing its thing in the landscape. How about some Texas tough grasses? We still have a couple of categories I'd like to get to. I think grasses and vines, and then we'll take questions. But what could you use in your landscape that doesn't run amok, stays pretty, looks great? How about a Texas native grass, little blue stem? This is a clump-forming grass. This one has particularly beautiful blue foliage with contrasting flower stems, and those are grass flowers way up at the top. But when that is winter, it will still be upright and it will be cinnamon colored. That photo on the left was taken out in the wild, and it makes these beautiful upright cinnamon clumps. So you can leave that for winter cover for birds and small wildlife, and for winter interest in your garden. On the right is what it looks like when those seed heads are forming, and that is doing its thing in the fall. That's about what it looks like right now. So you have 3 seasons of interest. I'm going to back up. You have the green foliage in the spring, followed by the seed head or the bloom stems and the seed heads starting to form, followed by that cinnamon foliage in the winter. I really like that it's good looking in several seasons, as well as providing as a host plant for butterflies and for seeds for birds. Side oats grama is another that does you know, lots of good things for us. It is a great shelter plant for butterflies, birds, and other small creatures. And it has these really neat seed heads where the seeds hang off to the side. And it's also our Texas state grass. So if you have children or grandchildren, this is a great one to put in your landscape. It thrives in really dry, tough soils, and it won't need supplemental water once you put this in. It's not looking for extra fertilizer and water and things like that from us. Inland sea oats. This one is frequently found growing in the shade in the wild. I found it growing in my dry, rocky woods in Cook County, and it's a deep, shady woods. But I've also seen it used successfully in sunny gardens. If you give it extra water, it will survive in the sun. If you don't plan to give it extra water, keep it in the shade and it will be just fine. It's got these distinctive, beautiful seed heads that hang off to the side like that. And those are even used in florists arrangements sometimes because they're so pretty. So it's got this really neat interest as well as taking up that shady space where you're having trouble finding things growing. It will tolerate more water. You sometimes see these along a stream side, but it doesn't require that extra water as long as it has shade. And there it is in my dry, rocky woods. Oh, I do have one. Here it is in a sunny garden in central Texas. This was full sun and it is making it fine right there. Hairy grama is another elegant ornamental grass that's native to Texas that you might consider. Each little stem has one of these little wispy seed heads up top, but the whole forms this neat clump with lots and lots of those sort of perched and waving about in the breeze above the leaves of the grass. It's quite beautiful as an accent grass, or you can mass it to form a solid swath of this. It's up to you how you want to use it. I think either way is pretty. We get to our Texas tough ground covers and vines. And I think we'll have plenty of time for questions too. I talk fast. I hope you can hear me talking this fast, but if you can't, the recording will be available so you can go back and watch again. Lyre leaf sage is one of those plants that you can almost not kill. So if you think you have a really brown thumb, you might try some lyre leaf sage. You can put it in the shade, you can put it in the sun, you can put it anywhere in between and it will bloom. I have a very large live oak in my front yard, and it is casting dense shade on the entire front yard on one side, and nothing was growing well. I couldn't grow grass anymore under that live oak. So I decided to let it fill in with lyre leaf sage. And this is now my new ground cover under that live oak, and we do not water that side of the yard at all, except for up near the house. And so this is thriving without any supplemental water in that area. It does seed out really freely. So if you can't tolerate them coming up in new places, don't plant it. But if that's fine with you and you want it to cover an area, it will do that for you. It's also evergreen. So you'll have a little rosette of purple to green leaves in the winter. And that keeps your soil covered. Sometimes other ground covers aren't evergreen and they'll allow that soil to be exposed over the winter. This will not, which is another good feature. Silver ponyfoot. We have a green ponyfoot native to Texas. Silver ponyfoot with that silver coloration that tells you, hey, I'm even more drought resistant, is one that you could use as a spiller in a pot arrangement or as a ground cover that creeps along, filling spaces in your garden. Here it is under a fence. Can't remember where that photo came from at all. But here it is in a pot in Houston. Now, Houston is pretty wet, and this thing was managing up in the pot. It may not have gotten any supplemental water there, but Houston is humid and wet anyway. So I think it's fairly versatile, but it will definitely take a dry soil. It will stand a dry soil. Here's the green counterpart. They're both lovely. This is often considered a lawn weed, but if we could just embrace its beauty instead, we could have mixed lawns that weren't so thirsty, weren't so maintenance intensive, and were actually way more water wise. Another tough Texas native is water clover. This is actually a bit of a misnomer. It's not a clover, and it will thrive in drier conditions. It's actually sort of a primitive fern, and it does spread via rhizomes and make this sort of a deep, not deep, but thick mat. It's only a few inches tall, about 8 inches tall at the maximum, and it will just make this coverage where you need it. That one, by the way, let's back up one, that water clover does like full sun. It will start to thin out in the shade. Frog fruit. Here's another Texas native local to our area that can spread and form a wonderful dense mat that stays low, has these tidy blooms on it, hosts pollinators both as a nectar and a host plant, and can do really well as a ground cover in your garden situation. I have friends that are just found this plant is thriving for them in the Dallas area. I get a little bit much shade for this, but in a sunny situation, this is great. This is actually at a rest stop in the Texas Hill Country, where we have these kind of curved sections of pavement with curved sections of soil in between. And this frog fruit has been allowed to fill that entire curved section. It's easy to trim back. You just take any kind of cutting tool you wish, or even your fingernails, and go by and prune off any bits that get out of bounds. Coral honeysuckle. Here's a local native. That's actually my back fence from many years ago before the trees got big. But this does grow in shady woods in our area. So it was taking a lot of sun at this point, but our whole block has since gotten shady. And I do see it growing in our shady woodlands and wild spaces. So I think it's fairly versatile. This was not a wet location, but I also find it in damp woods. You can see how dense those flowers will get. If it does have soil it really likes, it will just go to town and attract hummingbirds and butterflies. And then birds will come along and eat the berries later. There's a close-up of that coral honeysuckle because I couldn't resist. Another plant from Texas is the snapdragon vine. I've been watching one up at the Heard Museum in McKinney grow out of a tiny depression in chalk rock. And it grows out of this little crack in the rock. I know there's nothing under there because it's a boulder just sitting there. And it has been doing fine and blooming year after year, growing out of that chalk boulder with just a tiny pocket of dirt. It's definitely a water-wise plant from the hill country, and I think maybe even further south. Not sure on the range on that, but it does well in our Dallas area. There's another. This one was actually taken in Plano by Nancy Firth, doing very well in her garden, being allowed to just wander and twine in her other plants. It's an airy little vine. It's not a big beefy thing. It's not something that tears up your fence or your structures. It just sort of twines delicately around. And it will die back down to the ground each winter and come back from there. Now, for a beefier vine, you might be interested in crossvine, something that will cover your fence. This is semi-evergreen, has these lovely trumpets in the spring. There are some without the yellow that are more of a pure orange, a couple of different colors that you can buy. Hummingbirds love this, and it blooms right when they come through in the spring, and sometimes even again in the fall. It will cover very rapidly and easily any structure that you let it get near because it has these little sticky pads that it climbs with. And It can spread. It can travel via runners and come up in a new place that you don't expect it. Most people don't have trouble with this. For some reason in my yard, it did tend to spread quite a lot. So I'm constantly battling that. It's probably just the genetics of the particular plant that I got. Here it is covering my fence in the early days before I began to curse it and before it started spreading rapidly. But the hummingbirds did love this, and it may be worth your while to plant this, particularly if you're looking for an evergreen screening plant that also has a blooming interest. So I think that that is it. And I have covered all the categories of plants, but not thoroughly. There are lots and lots of other plants you can choose. For this program, they had to be versatile and they had to be drought tolerant to make the cut. And so I'm ready to take questions.
That was fantastic, Carol. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
All right, so our first question is, you mentioned watering by your house. Should you water your foundation even if your plants don't need water?
Okay, I am on black clay soil. And the recommendation for everyone on black clay soil is to water your foundation to protect it. I think it's going to crack anyway at some point unless you have a specially built foundation. Is what they do because of our shrink and swell soils. But if you are on black, heavy clay soil, you should look up foundation watering recommendations.
All right, I think you're absolutely right on that. So I was, I don't know if I ever knew this, but you mentioned the dwarf Yopon holly and the possum haw, that only the female plants produce berries.
That's correct.
Now, do you have to have a male plant nearby, or will the females produce berries regardless?
Good questions. Those plants are so widespread that it's typically not a problem to have a male nearby. There will be one somewhere. And so you can plant your female and expect berries if it is a female anywhere in the Dallas Metroplex area. If you get way out into the countryside and there's no wild Yopon around, you may not be able to produce berries on that. But I don't think there's ever going to be a problem if you're in the Metroplex area. And yeah, some varieties are all male. That Will Fleming will never produce berries because it is a male, and a lot of the dwarfs are also male.
Okay, so the picture you showed, it had, well, the Yopon had red berries. Is there a variety that has a kind of an orange berry?
Yes, both possum haw and Yopon, the berry color varies, and it can go from yellow, which is rare, through orange to a deep red. And there are actually some varieties that are named for their berry color. So if you're out at the nursery, pull out your, if you have a smartphone, pull that out and Google the name that's on the tag to find out what color berries you're really expecting from that one. There's one called Warren's Red, for instance, with a deep red berry.
Okay, because I was on a walk this morning and I noticed, like you mentioned, that those can be shaped, into different shapes, and it had like these orange berries on it, and so I'm thinking my money is going to be on it's a Yopon holly. So. All right, so the Texas Blue Star that you showed us, that was really, really pretty. It looked like pentas to me. Is that similar or related?
Okay, I can answer that. I don't think they're related. I'm not positive what the genus for pentas is, but this blue star is actually related to milkweeds and makes an interesting little long skinny pod on it. And so I'm pretty sure it is not related to pentas. Okay. But it is one of our Texas natives that it grows wild on my farm.
Nice. All right, so we do have a couple of more questions in the chat. So Grace is asking about filling up your yard with blooming plants such as wildflowers instead of having grass. Do you recommend that at all? And if so, are there books or articles that can provide guidance? I don't want my neighbors to become upset if we try this.
Super question. I've actually done that. And I can do that. I don't have an HOA. And so as long as I keep it off the sidewalk and it looks intentional and nobody complains locally, it's allowed. If you have an HOA, you need to check on their guidelines because they can be very strict. And the only way to fix that is to get on your HOA board or communicate very clearly with your HOA board that they're behind the times and that needs to change, because we will not have enough water for everyone in North Texas if we do not change our outdoor watering habits. So we need to have less turf grass. We need to have more areas that are water wise, and a wildflower meadow is a way to accomplish that, or just a portion of your yard. Cues of care and cues of intentionality are important if you want to try to start doing this and have your neighbors understand what you're doing, that you're not just letting this messy thing grow wild. So things like borders, stepping stones, benches, a bird bath that show that you are actually intentionally cultivating a specific area in a specific way for a specific effect. Those can go a long way towards letting people know what you're doing. Also getting a sign from, if you're allowed to post a sign, from Monarch Watch for a monarch way station, from National Wildlife Federation for a wildlife garden. Texas Parks and Wildlife may still be issuing signs, I'm not sure. Audubon Society. Those kinds of signs can help your neighbors understand what you're up to in your yard. I'm going to grab a drink while you read me the next question, but actually I have something to say, so I'll be right back.
Okay. So, you're absolutely right about making it look intentional with the borders and the stones and the signs. And I believe Texas Discovery Gardens also has a certification or something like that you can get too. And, whenever I do see those signs, my heart always goes out to that person because they're helping nature and our pollinators and our wildlife.
Yeah.
So, all right. And also, we're talking about like these zero grass yards. And yes, they are unusual, but they actually are around. And we
Yes.
will feature several homes that have zero grass. Some of them have zero grass in the front and backyards, and some are just zero grass in the front yard. So if you're interested, that is this Saturday at 10:30, and you can learn more at savedallaswater.com. And all right, where did our question go? Are there any nurseries you recommend in our area that have native plants? And they're trying to find some native ground covers in specifically.
Yes, there are. So there's Randy Johnson, who's out in Forney at Randy Johnson Organics. You can look him up on the internet and communicate with him. Bear in mind, he's sort of a one-man operation, so he may not answer his phone till after dark, and because he's out tending plants. North Haven in the Dallas, I believe it's actually in Dallas, has some staff members that are very familiar with native plants, and some of their plants are native, not all, but some. And if you're up in, if you're further out, there is Painted Flower Farms in Denton. There's Shades of Green in Frisco. And there are some over in the Fort Worth area as well. We actually do have quite a few nurseries where at least somebody on staff is familiar with natives. But what I was wanting to say earlier when I kind of ran out of juice and needed to grab a drink of water was I urge you all to find a copy, borrow a copy from the library if you want, of Douglas Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home. To begin to understand the crucial importance of planting natives in our landscape. It's not just about the water. It's not just about the reduced maintenance. It's not just about reduced fertilizer needs. All of those things are true, but it's more about saving us by saving the small creatures that we depend on. We need to be about preserving our pollinators, the ones that are left. We've done a pretty good job of reducing them unintentionally.
I agree completely. And pollinators supply us with 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat. And I like eating, and I want to continue eating.
Yeah, I want my grandchildren to be able to eat.
That's true too. And let's see. Looks like we have. We'll be wrapping up shortly. But I saw your picture of Ponyfoot. Is that the same as dollarweed?
Yes. I think it's often called dollarweed. There's another one, hydrocodal, that's also around. And because I never call it dollarweed, I'm not sure which is which right now. But it is dichondra. And so if you look up dollarweed and it says dichondra, that's a yes. But some of our problem is really that we need to shift our perception of plants. Just because it has weed in the name doesn't mean it's really a bad thing. And you know, the Europeans have embraced mixed lawns for a long, long time, and we are just slow to get there here. The sooner we do that and allow things like ponyfoot and clovers and things to be in our lawns, the sooner we can begin saving water, getting water to penetrate the ground better, and it's better for everyone.
Absolutely. And I actually think I have a little bit I have some turf in my backyard and I have some of it. I actually think it's pretty.
I do
It,
too.
it had the shape of the leaf and everything. And I had a neighbor come by and they were like, oh, this is dollarweed. This is going to take over. You need to get rid of it. And I was like, I don't know. I think I'm going to keep it because I like it.
Yeah. So something, if you've got to have perfectly manicured turf grass, I get it. Some people just really need that to feel good about what they're doing in their yard. Then you won't want it in there. But if you tried featuring it in a space of its own, you might find you really like the look of it in a different setting.
Absolutely. Okay. And it looks like, okay, this is going to be our last question. And can you explain how Rattlesnake Master got its name?
Sure. It's a great question. There is both some mythology and potentially some truth about that name. Some people used to say that you could take one of the seed heads from that and put it in your pocket and it would prevent a rattlesnake bite. I would not count on that at all. But a plant that is very closely related that lives in Jordan, and another plant, I think it's turkey, that's closely related, actually are used as anti-venom treatments for scorpion stings. And so it and all the Native American tribes in the areas where this grew used it as a sort of a rattlesnake anti-venom drink in some way. And if you know much about snakes, you know that a lot of times they give a dry bite. And so whatever you did, whether that was, unwrap a hard candy and give it to them, it might seem like it was miraculously effective if it was a dry bite anyway. But it's possible that there actually is some component of this plant that's effective. And we simply don't know yet.
That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. All right. And just to wrap up, we do have a feedback poll that we are launching. Please take a moment just to answer the 3 simple questions. It helps us with our future programming and to make sure we're supplying you with what you need. And you had mentioned, Carol, you had mentioned North Haven Gardens. They were hit by that tornado last year, and they have come back and they've had their grand opening recently. And you're right, they are very knowledgeable and very good folks. And actually, one of their representatives will be one of our speakers on the Waterwise Landscape Tour this Saturday, talking about new trends for 2021. So everybody is welcome to register for that. It is free. Everyone is welcome. It is virtual. You can find out more information at savedallaswater.com. And we also put a link somewhere in the chat for the direct WebEx registration. And of course, if you follow Green Dallas on social media, you will be bombarded with reminders about the upcoming seminar on Saturday. So,
I happen to know that Rattlesnake Master is going to be a little bit more available in the future. One of our local growers that supplies nurseries has decided to grow that for commercial availability. So it's coming.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to have to get in line for that. Maybe there's a waiting list I can sign up for. All right. So Carol, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and your fantastic presentation. I also want to thank the Dallas Public Library for hosting the series. And remember, this will be on the Dallas Public Library's YouTube page if you ever need to reference it again. And if you pre-registered, you will be getting an email in a day or two with some more information and a link to download your own copy. And the Dallas Public Library has plenty of online virtual programs. There is actually a garden talk session tomorrow. I believe it's at noon that you can sign up for, and you can ask all your burning gardening questions in that session. And next week on Monday, to celebrate Veterans Day, we actually have Veterans Produce. And this gentleman is a veteran. He has a hydroponics and aquaponics greenhouse that he will talk about and tour us through. So make sure to sign up for that one too. So thank you all very much. We appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.